start off with the first start off with the first slide here, which is an introduction to quality risk management and the ICHQ guideline, which kind of gives us the direction in which we should be following when we are applying quality risk management. So the relevance, we'll be looking at the relevance of risk management. Some definitions of risk management as well. Risk is defined as a combination of probability of harm occurring and the severity of that harm. We have stakeholder perspectives as well. QA teams must navigate diverse stakeholder perspectives, including patients, medical practitioners, government, and industry as well. It also supports enhanced decision making, and this is one that I think is one of the very, very useful elements of ICHQ 9 as well, where we're using a risk-based approach to make decisions, and this can be very much part of if you're in an inspection with your regulator or something like that, where you've made a decision to follow a certain process that may be not to the letter of the guideline that that regulator has given you, where you need to justify why you've made that decision that suits your business and why there's no risk there. So it definitely supports those decision making areas. The next one then would be the purpose of risk assessment as well. The, and after that, sorry about this now, flexibility. Yeah, that's the one I wanted to talk about as well. With regards to the ICHQ guideline, is very much prescriptive around what tools and how to approach risk assessment, but it also talks about flexibility and allows us to maybe combine or bring in different ways of risk assessing an item which would be more suitable to your business as well and your business needs. We talk about communication as well, and how important it is to communicate everything to your team, your wider community, your customers around risk, particularly if you have some residual risk left in your processes as well, that you communicate that residual risk so that people are conscious of this is a critical area. And I suppose the scope of ICHQ 9 as well, it looks after, from the beginning, purpose of the guideline, it provides the principles and the examples of tools for quality risk management. It, the application areas, where it applies, development, manufacturing, distribution, inspections, which I mentioned, submission and review of processes. It looks at the product types there, and all the product types that you would see here would be, drug substance, products, biologicals. It also looks at the material, covers the solvents, the excipients, and all the materials that go into manufacturing of the product and the finished product as well. And then, of course, the life cycle coverage, which we'll mention a couple of times throughout this, because it's important that we remember that it's not just about manufacturing, but it's about, from the very beginning of a drug being discovered all the way through to a discontinuation of a drug. Quality risk management, then the process, I suppose it starts off, it's like a systemic process. Quality risk management is a structured approach to assess, control, communicate, and review risks to the quality in pharmaceutical products throughout their life cycle. It has decisions can occur at any point, and using some of the tools around decision trees and stuff like that, where you can actually use quality risk management each time that you make a decision to support that decision and to ensure patient safety, which is the ultimate goal in all of what we do here. Responsibility then as well, it's important to mention that interdisciplinary teams should be conducted, and the temptation to maybe do risk assessments on your own is probably not a good thing, because then you only get one person's perspective. And it's always very good to involve as much of a multidisciplinary team as possible, so that you're getting the inputs from your engineering department, your cleaning people, and your operators as well, because as I said, the operators are the ones that know what goes on. They also know how things can go wrong. Decision makers are responsible for coordination of risk assessments across the functions, ensuring processes are defined. So initiating the process of risk assessment, you must define the problem. I think that's really important. I mean, if you don't know what you're trying to solve or you don't know what you're trying to examine, it's important, it's very difficult to do a risk assessment. And also you need to probably look at how broad that scope of that problem is as well, because one risk assessment may not be enough. And as they say, solving a very large problem is like eating an elephant, and you do it one bite at a time. So it is better to break it down, define the problem that you're trying to look at that particular time, and then apply your risk assessment tool. Gathering relevant data and background as well. Without data, if you don't measure, it's very difficult to manage. So having the available and relevant data to hand when you're doing a risk assessment will be very important in the process. Identifying leaders and allocating resource as well to this risk assessment. Sometimes it can be a very big you know, complex process, and therefore you need the adequate resources to be able to do it. Setting timelines as well and deliverables is a very good idea as well, and decision making levels, so that you understand, and you time bound certain activities within it, so that you can achieve your deliverables. And then flexibility, I suppose, like that's the whole idea of this guideline is to allow it to be effective within your business, but also to protect the patient and to ensure that you're producing a quality product that doesn't have any risk. So flexibility in the sense of using different tools, flexibility in fitting the risk assessment approach around your own business and your own needs as well, to achieve the best outcome, is also covered in the guideline. And there's a good demonstration there of the guide. This comes directly out of the guideline as well on risk management process. That just kind of gives you. It's always easier to see it in a process flow as to how the process of risk assessment should be managed. Um, you have like risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. Obviously, then the main aim then will be to reduce risk and accept risk. And it's important that we continue then to communicate out these risk assessments, review it, and obviously then when any changes within the business, to have that review and update of the risk assessment. It should be a live document. It shouldn't be put into your drawer. It is something that we do tend to do in our heads as well, and follow that process. And I suppose if we bring it back to real life, I always say, use the example of, if maybe you're a house that doesn't have children visiting your house too often, and somebody's coming to stay over with a 3-year-old, you very quickly have to do a risk assessment across everybody, everything in the house, to see what is dangerous, and you're taking corrective actions there by putting a gate on your stairs and maybe hiding the best china and that type of thing. So it's you wouldn't do that just once. You'd probably be doing that all the way through the day, and you'd be identifying new risks that weren't obvious, and looking after them as well. So if you can apply that to a more documented systemic approach, within our industries where everything has to be documented and recorded, it's very similar but different, in the sense that you are going to be doing that documentation. Um, that just brings us on to the principles of quality risk management then as well. I mean, the guideline asks for the following. So scientific approach, um, that's linked to patient and safety. So we're not looking at risks necessarily to a business when we're doing these risk assessments. We're always focusing on risk to the patient, risk to the quality of the product, risk to the efficacy of the product as well. However, business risks can come into this as well. From my own experience, I think if we look at business risks, as being part of patient safety, because if a business, is if there's risk there to how the business performs, then that business may not be able to sustain um, themselves, and therefore could cause shortage of medicines to patients as well. So it is important that we maintain a good quality level of business as well. The next one there, proportionate of effort, an important one, because sometimes we get very caught up in doing risk assessments for everything, because we think that's what the regulation is asking us to do. It's asking us to risk assess absolutely everything in our process, in our business. But actually, sometimes if we get too involved in that, we could miss the important things and spend an awful lot of time and wasted effort on items that actually aren't really as important. So it's important then that you look at the effort that you put into these risk assessment is actually in line with the level of risk that is being caused by that particular process. Patient protection then, if anybody on the call knows me, they know that everything a patient is at the heart of everything I do, and every job that I do is always something that the patient is at the heart of. So quality risk management is that's what it's all about in some very simple terms. The primary focus of quality risk management is to ensure the safety and efficacy of pharmaceutical products for patients. And it is one of those things that we will unfortunately probably have to rely on ourselves in later life, or a family member. So the patient it can often be ourselves. The life cycle approach then as well, quality risk management should be applied throughout the entire life cycle of the pharmaceutical product. So it's not just something that we do in a manufacturing environment. We do it outside of all of the support areas of manufacturing, including supply chain, which I suppose that's the area I tend to focus in because that's my comfort zone. But you always think, like, if you have the big pharmaceutical companies where you have all of the lovely controls and everything in place, it's all within four walls. But then when it goes out into the supply chain, how much more the risk can grow, when you're using trucks and warehouses, and it's a little bit of a less controlled environment, so there can be much higher risks in that area. Flexibility then, both formal and informal risk assessment approaches are acceptable depending on the situation and the level of risk. So it is like that informal risk assessment is often can be common sense. Applying common sense to things can be a good thing as well. And it is a form of risk assessment. It's literally just opening your eyes, seeing what's in front of you, and you'll identify the risks then as well, and doing something about it. If you see a bucket on the floor that somebody can fall over, you don't have to go and get a team together and do a full formal FMEA risk assessment. Just move the bucket, and it is down to that level of from informal risk management as well. But the formal risk management then for documentation is requirement. The integration of the quality system then, I mean, it should a risk assessment from, it's part of a very much a fundamental part of the quality management system. It's how your SOPs are put together in the first place, so how they're designed. We should have risk management at the heart of that, because we want to make sure that our processes are as much without risk as possible. It's not always it's not always possible to remove risk completely, but if we can manage risk down to an acceptable level, then we have a good quality management system. And we'll talk about later as to how risk assessments and risk management can support deviation management, change management, design, equipment, facilities, all of this. So it really is at the heart of everything that we do within quality management systems. Decision making support as well. And this is the one I probably get a little bit passionate about this, because I love it. I love the fact that risk management comes into this decision making support, because all too often in my career I'm being questioned by auditors, by inspectors, as to why I haven't done something, or why we didn't follow this guideline, or why aren't we mapping warehouses every year? And everyone's answer to that is always, well, we take a risk-based approach. But it's not good enough just to say we take a risk-based approach. We have to prove that, and we have to show that we've documented that and how we've done it. So some of the tools that are within quality risk management are fantastic at supporting inspections. And if you can produce a really well thought out FMEA style risk assessment, or any of the other tools, and you're able to present that to an inspector and an auditor, um, it makes much more sense then to say, well, this is why we've made the decision, and when we were making this decision, we risk assessed it, and we identified that actually we could mitigate the risks down to a very acceptable level. Um, and then, from the actual guideline itself, it does not create any new regulatory requirements. So this guideline, it doesn't It's not an additional requirement to what you have to do. It's just basically a guideline that takes you through what you were always expected to do by the regulations anyway. So it's important to note that this is not something new and it's not an additional requirement. Let's move to the next slide. So integration then, it's important that this is not seen as just a quality function. Integration into quality systems is important. Quality risk management supports science-based and practical decisions when integrated into a quality system. But it also supports regulatory compliance. So effective quality risk management facilitates compliance with regulatory requirements and does not place the need for communication between industry and regulators. Improved decision making, and I mentioned that earlier. It is one of those areas that I particularly love. Quality risk management being applied to decision making. Quality risk management enables better and more informed decisions, providing regulators with greater confidence in the company's ability to manage those risks. And it also avoids that question that we all get uncomfortable with when we're explaining to an inspector, what are we doing, what this is the way the process is, and how we made certain decisions. And then we get that question that says, and can you show me where you documented that? So the risk assessment is a fantastic tool there to show people where you've documented the strategy around your decision. Resource optimization then as well is important element of that. Facilitates better use of resources by both industry and regulatory bodies. So in other words, that if you're taking a risk-based approach, it will avoid you doing unnecessary tasks, and therefore you're able to redirect your resource to more important and more rewarding and more activities that support the patient and our industry. Training and confidence building as well is another one. Training industry and regulatory personnel in quality risk management processes enhances understanding, builds confidence in decision making, and I think it also supports culture, because if you've got a culture in your organization where people are, encouraged to raise concerns, encouraged to always look for the risk, then you've got a very good culture where the patient is at the heart of everything you do, and people are not afraid or they don't feel like if they raise this, they're going to be, maybe there's going to be a bad reflection on them or something like that. So training and confidence building is very much part of the integration. Um, Documentation then as well, as in pharma, it's in any quality management system, you always hear the phrase, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So documenting this quality risk management should be integrated into existing operations and documented appropriately. So where you have a really, really good culture in an organization is where people come to you with ideas and they say, we've already risk assessed this, and this is how we've documented, and this is why we see that there's an acceptable level of risk of introducing this new process. I suppose if you're dragging the risk assessment out of people, or you say to people, well, maybe if you risk assess that and that puts them off doing the idea, then they're probably not fully integrated into the system of risk assessment and risk management. Global collaboration then is a common understanding, and applications of quality risk management principles can promote consistent decision making. So ICHQ is all about aligning our highly regulated regions of the world together in one sort of aligned way of doing things. And ICHQ 9, then if you're following that, then there's a better chance that your counterparts across the globe will also be following the same principles, and therefore their decision making become more, they're fostered in with mutual confidence. um, Methodology then, when it comes into this is where we get into the nuts and bolts of quality risk assessment. We have a purpose of risk management methodology. We have the recognized tools. The pharmaceutical industry and regulators can use established risk management tools so that everybody kind of understands the approach and everybody has that common terminology around how we've achieved our risk assessment and our outcomes. So basic facilitation methods, example like flow charts, check sheets, process mapping is fantastic, cause and effect diagrams as well. And the one that I suppose is most commonly used in the industry is the FMEA analysis. The failure mode, there's another one there that the guideline lists, which is FMECA, which is very similar to the failure mode effect analysis, but it also brings in that critical analysis as well and shows much more justification as to where the scoring came from, how you've mitigated, and how much then that you can reduce the risk from what it was previously to with the new controls that you're introducing, how much more how much more impact that can have. So your traditional approaches then would be historically risks to quality have been managed informally using observations, trends, and other empirical methods. And we shouldn't write those traditional ones off altogether just because they're old fashioned. I mean, they've stood the test of time and they can be absolutely fine to use. Um, it is important here when we talk about adaptability that the tools can be tailored for specific areas relating to drug substance and product quality. So, if you think that you could do like say a fault tree analysis or and combine that with an FMEA to get the right outcome, the tools are adaptable to do that. And, there's no harm in being a little bit creative when it comes to how you use these tools. The combination of tools, which is what I just mentioned there, where you might be able to just combine a number of the tools to really drill down into your process so that you can identify the risks. And rigor and formality, I suppose it's part of our everyday life, and pharma is rigor and formality. It's about doing everything until it's to our best of our abilities. Applying the quality risk management should align with complexity and criticality, the issue being addressed. So again, how much rigor do we put into something? How much rigor do we need to put into something? We need to keep that in mind as well, and then using the recognized tools as well. Okay. Jumping into those tools now, we are looking at a list of tools here that are all mentioned in the guideline. Basic facilitation methods such as flow charts, and these are great at explaining the problem. I suppose in my experience when I used to work in process improvement, it was always great to have a flow chart at the very beginning that describes the process. And after you've risk assessed it and redesigned it and put in lots of controls, you then have a flow chart that sometimes can look quite different. It can look simpler because you may have taken out some unnecessary steps, or it can look more complex because you've put in extra controls. But it's always really good to look at the before and the after to see how far you've come when using these tools as well. Um, and a cause and effect diagram, and a fishbone to show where the problems lie. So failure mode then is the FMEA is one of those tools. Failure mode, critical analysis, which I've already mentioned, fault tree analysis. HACCP, HACCP is something that if people are working in the food industry, they'll be very, very familiar with HACCP. You don't see it as much in the pharmaceutical industry, but I think it's an important one and it could be very helpful because it will show your critical control points. So after you've done your FMEA, when you know where your risks are, where the high risks are, you can then use HACCP to control those areas. So it's all about signage, it's all about color coding. And one of the greatest examples, and so simple as well in the food industry, is where you have those different colored chopping boards so that you ensure that you don't have cross contamination. Whoever came up with that is a genius. It was very, very simple and is adopted in a lot of kitchens now. So yeah, so that's just some of the tools. I won't labor it too much, but I do want to go into a worked example now. So just give me time and I'll just switch my screen. Um, Should be looking at more of a spreadsheet here now, if everybody can see this, I hope. And I just wanted to demonstrate using 3 examples, and I'm going to, switch in and out of this a little bit through this hour so that you can have a look at how we apply this. And again, I've adapted this to be an FMEA, FMECA type risk assessment, where you have the problem statement over here, but you also have where it is. So we'll say it's a premises, it's a facilities type of risk area of the business. It's in your warehouse of a manufacturing facility where critical temperature sensitive product is being stored. And then the risk that you've identified is that there's a door opening will cause temperature excursion. So very simple, but very much a problem in our industry. Anyone who's working in supply chain or manufacturing will have come across temperature excursions. So the probability of that causing a temperature excursion in this particular case would be a 7. And I'm using a 1 to 10 scale here. So 7 is very close to 10. So I've scored that quite high. Yes, the probability that if somebody opens the door, you're going to have a different temperature coming into a room. It's going to cause a temperature excursion. So I didn't justify that because it's fairly obvious. Harm then, if your product is very temperature sensitive, then the harm to the product will be quite high here as well. And I'm probably not justifying that because because I'm scoring it high. And I'm just saying in this particular time, this, let's just say there's no controls here in place at all. So therefore it's not visible. You don't have any temperature monitoring. So therefore your visibility will be of, detectability is usually the scale turned upside down. So 10 being the lowest form of detectability. And that's of course putting the score up to 490 here, which is definitely quite high and it's in the red. Then, we're going to have to do something about this. So you move on to your next stage of that risk process where you're going to identify some mitigation. So you wouldn't go ahead with this at all. You wouldn't allow this to happen within your business. So without these controls. So you may complete a qualification of the warehouse. So you might want to find out where are the risk areas of the warehouse to see where you're going to put your monitoring. You're going to install your temperature monitoring system using monitors placed as per the mapping results. And you're going to install alarms maybe on the door as well. Very effective situation where if you have that door and you don't want it left open for more than 5 minutes, then you might put an alarm on it that actually is going to have a big audible siren that's going to annoy everybody. At that point so that people are aware, and that will not only tell people to close the door when it happens, but they'll actually want to avoid that horrible noise, so they'll actually then become more conscious of that door not being left open. You might want to go a little bit further than that and spend some money here around installing an air curtain. Again, that effort of that needs to be commensurate with the risk. So if it's really really temperature sensitive, then an air curtain could be a solution as well to reduce the risk. And then, the impact on the door opening is less. Okay, so if you look at all of these controls, you're not probably, with the exception of the air curtain, you're probably not going to reduce the probability too much. But if you installed the air curtain, you certainly would. Um, the harm you will, again, if you have temperature alarms, you're going to be able to react quicker. So you may then reduce the harm to the product, and then the detectability. And I suppose that's the one that you really have a huge amount of influence on here with these controls, because you're going to make it so that the door is open, or that there's been a temperature excursion. So once you've identified all of these controls, you would then go into that critical analysis of how would those controls impact the scores that you've already identified. So probability, as I said, if you have that air curtain in there and you can reduce down the number of times the door is open, then your probability of a temperature excursion is going to be reduced. The harm is certainly going to be reduced to the product if you reduce the number of the probability of it. And then the visibility goes way up to the number 1, which is on the scale of it's highly detectable. with the audible alarm on the door and then the temperature monitoring system as well. So you can see here very clearly that it's brought the risk right down to a very acceptable level, a huge difference between 490 and 9. And you know then that you've done enough here. If for, I will have an example later on as well where this may not have been as good a result, and therefore, and we can look at that. So I'm just going to move on back into my presentation now. So just give me a second. Okay, move back into our slides. So moving on from that, then we look more in depth into the actual methodology of risk assessment. So checklist analysis, always a good one actually. I remember a good few years ago, somebody came to me and was trying to apply an FMEA to an assessment of a new product coming in to the process, and they were really struggling with how they couldn't really sort of gel one with the other. And we said, well, actually, do you know what? We're just using the wrong tool here. We shouldn't be using FMEA. We should be using just a simple checklist. What category is the product? What's the temperature requirements of the product? Does the facility is the facility able to hold those temperatures? Have we got the right licenses? Is there any risk of cross contamination? And that whole checklist mentality of a way of risk assessing something was then be very much effective. And you could see the person was greatly relieved because there was awful confusion going on just because they were using the wrong tool. The decision tree then is always a good one as well. It's particularly if you want to be able to demonstrate to people when this happens, this is what you need to do. So if you've worked your example through a decision tree where you can actually say, well, if it's a low alarm, this is what you do. If it's a high alarm, this is what you do, and who you report it to, and everything else, and the process becomes much simpler. And even by doing that, you will remove risk, the risk of not understanding or not making the wrong decision, I suppose. And then the risk ranking filter then is important tool for comparing and ranking risks as well. And again, if you go back to where we said the effort being commensurate with the level of risk, this risk filtering means that you will put some priorities on what you need to look at first. The fault tree analysis then is a deductive technique that assumes failure of the functionality of the product. From the failure of the functionality, the process looks at possible causes. So it's almost it's almost a really going from it at it from a very negative point of view and saying, it is going to fail. What would you do? Okay. And none of us like to appear negative, but sometimes that's just absolutely necessary when you're doing risk assessment. You have to look at the worst case scenario. Um, some applications then and examples of applications, quality risk management can be applied to various industries and regulations, operations, including quality management, development. Very, very important that we apply risk management at the very, very beginning, because that can be a very valuable preventative tool, and can save a lot of money as well. And that's what our senior leadership teams in our organizations like to hear as well. So one thing that when you're applying quality risk management, sometimes people think, oh God, you're going to come up with a whole load of expensive controls now and everything will cost the company money. But actually, if you apply it at the very early stages, you can save a lot of money. Facilities, equipment and utilities, materials management as well, and the production, laboratory controls and stability testing, making sure that you're actually testing for the right things when you're designing the testing, and when testing is happening as well, that you're following risk management principles. Packaging and labeling, which is really important area of the business. And it can be, if you look at recalls and stuff like that, it's all too often the fault of the packaging as opposed to the fault of the material that the medicine itself. Packaging can cause, I suppose, the labeling there can be extremely important when it comes to safety of medicine. The difference between a medicine and a poison is dosage. So when you look at that, then if you've got the wrong dosage on the package, you could do some serious damage to a patient. So it's important that we apply risk management principles there, and then inspection and assessment activities as well. And it is absolutely an expectation now that if you are making, if you're applying decision risk based decisions to your business, that you can back them up with recognizable risk assessment methodologies. So, is a formal tool always required? Absolutely not. Formalizing something is documenting it, and that is a requirement. But can you do an informal risk assessment? Absolutely. You're looking at standard QRM tools used can range from general qualitative risk-based approaches, examples, decision trees and everything else. But the most basic tool in our arsenal is to write a technical scientific rationale based on available data. So you're looking at the data and you're going, is there a problem or is there not a problem here? And I suppose for the manufacturers in the room, the available data and historical results demonstrating peak PK values above 1.33. Therefore, the process is deemed acceptable. So in other words, you can visualize that there now and you can say it's all under um, it demonstrates that PPK values are above 1.33, therefore there's no problem. So at a glance, you can see whether there's risk or whether there isn't. Moving into FMEA then, as a tool in itself, the failure mode effects analysis, possibly the most popular one, one that everybody is recognise, evaluates potential failure modes in processes, and they're and it'll identify the problems. It'll allows then the priorities, so that you can go for your high scoring risks, so that you're prioritizing what to address. It gives great outputs as well, from effect of maybe an action plan to reduce risks. It's a great tool actually if you're design in the early stages of a project, and you have that project manager coming after you looking for examples of or looking for your action plan. So say if you're whatever area that you're working in, QA, production, engineering, you'll always have a project manager coming up and saying, look, we're launching this project. What are your actions? What do you need people to do? What do you need to do yourself? And a great way of approaching that is to do an FMEA, and it'll identify all of your mitigations, which then become your action plan. The benefits then, it helps identifying areas for preventative actions to minimize risk. So it's a very proactive tool to use, and it supports decision making and risk prioritization and control. And it's a fantastic document, I think, to put it in front of an inspector. It's something that's understood across the industry, and it can demonstrate a very logical approach to risk management. Okay. Just going back to, now I have to flick screens again, and I'm just going to bring that spreadsheet back onto our screen. Hold on now, just give me a second. Where's it gone? So I'm just going to go into example 2 here now, where it's a worked example. It's always is good to look at this. So again, it's the same problem statement as before. I've just approached the scoring differently because maybe this has been done in a different building or a different company. So in this particular example, I'm saying that actually there's some great controls already in place. So this is not new, and the probability of the temperature excursion is being scored here as 3 as opposed to the previous 7, because we're saying, and this is where you would justify or put in a statement to say why you think it's low. Very useful as well in an inspection, and I know inspectors hate to see people saying, oh, it's a low risk, but not actually saying why it's a low risk. And maybe when they go to explain why, they realize that it isn't a low risk. So it's important to put your thoughts in here. So in this situation, there's only three people who can open that door, and the door is access controlled so that only trained personnel can open the door. So that makes a huge difference because trained personnel will know that temperature sensitive product in there. I can't leave this door open. I can't wedge it open with fire extinguisher and all that good stuff. So if you've got like maybe contractors working on site and they're not as trained as people who are working there, then they may not even realize that they're causing a risk and they may hold the door open. And that has happened in my life anyway. I've definitely seen that happen in a facility. Here, I didn't reduce harm because, again, if it happens, it's not going to make that much difference. It's still going to be the same level of harm. So I didn't have to justify that. And then in this one, in this particular company, there was a monitoring system in place, but there was no monitoring near the door. So visibility on that wasn't great, but it was there, but it wasn't perfect because there actually was no monitor near the door, but there was product near the door, and that's the problem. Is that does the product get impacted before you actually know about it? So it's still coming in at a relatively high risk. It's fallen into the moderate category, but it's not acceptable. And we still have to do something more about that. So we can come up with some more mitigation here. So maybe we're going to add a temperature monitor between the door and the product so that we can increase this visibility. And we could also maybe look at the product as well and say maybe move more sensitive product further away. So again, we're not really going to impact the probability here, but we may be able to reduce the harm by having moving that sensitive product away. So management. So I am justifying this here because I'm reducing it from a previous score. So management have moved the product that is sensitive to the temperature to the other side of the room, so it's far away from that door and doesn't get impacted as much. And then the detectability, we're going to put in that additional monitor between the door and the product, so that actually we know about the temperature change before it actually hits the product, and that's bringing the visibility to the very highest level, and that's also given us a score of 15 there. Now, you can still see that that's amber. It's still not at an acceptable level, but the company has deemed this that there's not a whole lot more they can do. So therefore, they're going to recognize that this is a risk and maybe apply HACCP to this now and recognize it as a critical control point where we need extra signage. We need to be constantly vigilant of that area of the facility. Okay. I'm going to switch back now to our presentation. Just give me 2 seconds. Okay. The next slide then, we look at a failure mode acceptance critical analysis, which those examples have given you. That's really a demonstration of where we've critically analysed the impact of our mitigations. So failure, it's an extension really of the FMEA that incorporates a degree of severity, probability of occurrence, and detectability of consequences. So a lot of the times when I go out to companies who are doing risk assessment, a lot more than you realize miss that detectability. And if you're not putting detectability into your risk assessments, you're actually going to struggle to reduce risk to an acceptable level, because sometimes you can't impact the harm. If it happens, this is what it's going to do, and you cannot do anything about that. So if you take, say, a clean room, a sterile environment, um, if contamination happens, the product is going to be ruined. There's nothing you can do at that stage, so you can never reduce that. The probability, yes, you can reduce by gowning people, maybe taking people out of the area altogether and using an isolator, then your probability will go right down, but your harm still stays the same. Detectability is the one that can reduce your risk to a more successful, a more acceptable level. So therefore, you would put in, some alarms that, you'd put in your settle plates, and so you'd be able to detect maybe a low level of contamination and do something about it before you have that really big impact. And that's where your FMCA really comes into, in very useful. Fault tree analysis, very, in a different situation where you find that FFCA doesn't, then maybe fault tree analysis is something that you would apply as well, where you're going to look at the failure modes and then you're going to analyze, certain decisions. It relies on process understanding from experts to identify causal factors. So that's really important that you have that knowledge when you're trying to do a fault tree analysis. Um, and the applications then of that would be to investigate complaints or deviations. So, a little bit like a fishbone, where you're going to have to actually investigate using a toolkit then to bring you to where it all went wrong. Ensures that improvements address the root cause, and that's really important. In deviation, we're not looking at deviation today, but it is very much part of risk management. So we're looking at finding the correct root cause, because if you don't do that, then your CAPAs may not be effective at all. Evaluate how multiple factors contribute to the specific issue as well. So don't just look at one area that's causing the problem. It could be other things that are causing the problem as well. And if we go back to that temperature excursion, we're all focusing on the door here, but actually maybe the HVAC that's heating and cooling, it could be improved. Maybe it's not working to its full capacity as well, and maybe the door shouldn't be as impactful. So it is important to look outside the box there. An output of FTA then provides a visual representative of the failure modes, which is great because you can then present it to other teams as well, and they can maybe input more of their knowledge into controlling it. Useful for risk assessments and developing monitoring programs. Absolutely. So HACCP we talked about a little bit already, so I won't dwell on it. It is about the hazard analysis and critical control points. So it's about identifying where the issues are, particularly where you've mitigated as much as you possibly can, but you still need people to be aware that there's still risk in this area. So it's about highlighting that and having extra vigilance and extra control in that area. Okay. There's the 7 steps there of HACCP as well, determining the critical control points, establishing critical limits for each control point. And when you look at maybe the modern versions of processes and process monitoring, where actually you're not sampling at the end to find out there's a problem, that you're actually monitoring all the way through the process, that's where you're identifying the critical limits of that process, so that you get an early warning of an issue and you can take remediation action. So you're setting up a system to monitor the critical control points, and you're then defining corrective actions as you go along. These are, a very modern approach to manufacturing, but it also means that you get way less waste in your process. Verify that HACCP systems is working effectively as well. So unlike in all of these things, it's a circle, isn't it? You don't just do it once, you have to keep verifying and verifying that it's effective. ICHQ 9 examples then of application, the annex offers illustrative examples of how quality risk management. So if you do want to have a look at the applications, it talks about integrated quality management, it talks about development, it talks about facilities, equipment and utilities and so on there. And then the applications and regulatory operations as well, inspections and assessment activities. It looks at resource allocation within that, inspection planning, evaluation of quality defects and regulatory follow-ups. We all like to think that we're inspection ready at every moment of the day, and you'll have a much better sleep at night if you are. But there are always some preparation there to be done, and particularly if you're looking for something new on your license or it's a brand new license, you will be preparing for that inspection. Key benefits then, facilitates better decision making, which we mentioned already, promotes mutual confidence, consistent decision making, and supports continual improvement. And then just to mention, flexibility. And I'm just going to go back into another that final stage of that worked example as well. Just conscious of time and want to get everyone gets the full benefit. So I did go through another worked example here where same issue, that temperature excursion, the probability was very low because they had the external door was part of a site checks, and there was knowledge and awareness and signage all over it. So, this the next stage. Maybe this is the following year after you've put in the previous risk mitigations. The harm, again, it's not changing, it's still going to be there, but the visibility is still up. So in this case here, you've done your review of the risk assessment. Actually, it's now an acceptable risk, and there's no more action required. So that's just the final stages of that. As I said, it's a very much a living, breathing activity that you continue to do right through your processes. So sorry, back to the slides now. So flexibility, the selection of risk management tools depend on specific facts and circumstances, allowing for tailored application. Again, I've added in more slides, and I believe these will be shared with you. This again is just a demonstration of that scoring that I had applied to those worked examples. Where it's a 1 to 10, and really, again, mentioning flexibility, you can design this in any way you want. Some people use just a high, low, medium. Some people like to use numbers, because then they can calculate actual, and that's where you bring in that scientific approach. So we did the work example, adding value then to your organizations. It's very much risk management, very much supports change control, deviation kappa, and decision making. So I think we're very close to being out of time here now. Questions, I just want to talk about questions. We probably don't have time to take questions here, but people have submitted questions, and please do submit more questions either in the chat here or send them on um, to us, and we will try to answer all of your questions. There is just one or two there that I had gotten maybe a week ago, so I just put together some responses as well. So if you're on the call and you've asked this question, how to apply risk-based approaches to medicinal device industry. Well, the entire medicinal device industry, the life cycle from design and manufacturing to post-market surveillance, um, you can identify and assess and mitigate potential risks. These approaches ensure product safety and quality by implementing controls such as improved materials, process monitoring, supplier evaluation, and clear packaging and labeling. Overall, though, I'd say that this enhances patient safety, supports better decision making, enhance regulatory compliance, and enable continuous risk management throughout the device life cycle. So I think probably what I'm saying there is it doesn't, it applies to the it can be applied to the medical device industry as much as it could be to medicine itself. The other question I got as well was how is companies using QRM to decide on vendor requirements to be audited? And it's one that is close to my heart as well, because it's important that we understand that we don't have to put an awful lot of effort in if it's not needed, so that we can put the effort in where it is needed. So if you're looking at vendor management, if a vendor is coming onto your premises to do something, you could use that as a justification to not to have to audit their premises. So a great example on that is maybe a pest control vendor. So you've got your pest control company coming in. I'm not saying you don't assess them. You might do a postal audit, a desktop audit. You definitely would look at historical, maybe references as well from other industries. But when they come in, they do it on site. So you are generally signing off on everything that they do. They're not making any major decisions without your know-how, and therefore you'll have a lower scale of vendor auditing. And then I suppose the other way of using that would be, you might say, well, what does this vendor do? How critical is their function to you? How many decisions do they make without your knowledge? And therefore, you might do a more in-depth audit of them as well. So hopefully that answers that question. Just moving on, I'm going to hand you over to Rashika now to close the session.
Thanks, Patricia. It was a really, really informative webinar, and a lot of, I think, people were asking few questions and also interacting. So it was great, and I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar today and learned as much as possible. So, our upcoming webinars, Lunch and Learn webinar is on Prompt Engineering 101. writing AI prompts that save you 5 hours a week. That will be on 12th of May. Courses which are right now live and you can register your interest is introduction to biopharmaceuticals and advanced personalized therapies. That will go live on 22nd September. And then we do have some UCD Professional Academy diplomas, which we are giving at a subsidized price of 760, and Skill Sprint at 395 euros only. If you can all go to our website and search and register your interest for all of these courses. Can you change the slide, please,
Mhm.
Patricia?
Oh, way ahead of you there.
Yeah, thanks. So, if you like the webinar, please do scan the QR code for this feedback form. It will just take you 2 minutes of your time, and also help us better delivering the webinar and also having few more interesting topics like these. And thanks everyone again for attending and being here throughout the webinar. And I hope um, to see you again for
Yeah,
these
no,
lunch
and
and learn webinar sessions.
and I'd like to say thanks to BioPharmachem SkillsNet for giving me this opportunity to talk to you all. Absolutely fantastic. And if you have any questions or need our help in anything else, we're always willing to listen and be delighted to talk to you.
And thanks to Orion GXP as well for having this webinar and so much information sharing.
Thanks, Rashika.
Thank you. And we will be sharing the slides with you all guys and also with the feedback form. And in case if you have any questions, please pop up in the chat and we'll try to email you the answers.
Absolutely, absolutely no problem with that.